Hi class. Hi class. Today we are going to talk about intestinal contractions and motility. Now there are two major types of contractions in the small intestine. The first one is peristalsis. I want you to understand that peristalsis is a relatively weaker type of movement in the small intestine. It is very strong in the esophagus and stomach. The other type of movement is segmentation. Know that segmentation is the dominant contractile force in the small intestine. Segmentation helps to break down the food or the chyme further and get mixed with digestive juices. Now, the question is, what causes the intestine to contract? Now, if you look at the intestine, it has smooth muscle cells. Mixed with the smooth muscle cells are some specialized cells called interstitial cells of Cajal or simply called Cajal cells. Now remember, these Cajal cells are not neurons. They are neither muscle cells. Now these Cajal cells work like pacemaker cells and they produce something called slow waves. Now, before we talk more about the slow waves and how these Cajal cells work, let's talk a little bit about muscle cells and Cajal cells and how they're actually connected to each other. Okay. So moving on to the next slide. Okay, let's look at the picture. In this picture, we see some blue cells. These cells are interstitial cells of Cajal or known as Cajal cells. Now remember, these Cajal cells produce slow waves as I mentioned before. Also, I want my students to remember that slow waves are not action potentials. They are not action potentials. Now, if you look at the Cajal cells, they are connected to each other by gap junctions. Okay, and below the blue Cajal cells, we see spindle-shaped, red-colored smooth muscle cells. Now, the smooth muscle cells are also connected to each other by gap junctions. And the Cajal cells are connected to the smooth muscle cells by gap junctions as well. So, to review, the blue cells are Cajal cells. They are connected to each other by gap junctions. The Cajal cells are connected to the underlying smooth muscle cells by gap junctions. And the smooth muscle cells are connected to each other by gap junctions. So we see here that every cell is connected to the neighboring cell by gap junctions. Okay, and what do we know about gap junctions? Gap junctions facilitate movement of ions from one cell to the other. When we hear gap junctions, we think of faster communication between cells, and you have learned this in anatomy before. All right, so now we know which are the Cajal cells and which are the smooth muscle cells. And I also mentioned that the Cajal cells, they do not produce action potential, but they produce something called slow waves. What are slow waves? Slow waves are waves of depolarization. They're just depolarizing signals. And these Cajal cells are also called pacemaker cells, which kind of set up a rhythm of slow waves. Now, if a slow wave is strong enough, it is conducted via gap junctions to the underlying smooth muscle cells, as seen by the black arrow here. So the black arrow represents slow waves being conducted towards the smooth muscle. Now, once it reaches the smooth muscle, it It causes voltage-gated calcium ion channels to open up, which are present on the smooth muscle. And as these calcium channels open up, positively charged calcium enters the smooth muscle cells. Influx of positive charge causes these smooth muscle cells to depolarize, and when these cells are depolarized enough, the smooth muscle cells shoot out action potential. This action potential will ultimately lead to contraction of the intestinal muscles. So to review, let's review this one more time. Alright, so on top we see some blue cells with long cytoplasmic extensions, and these are called Cajal cells. Very good. The Cajal cells are connected to each other by gap junctions. Do they produce action potential? No, they only produce slow waves, which are waves of depolarization. At the bottom of the picture, we see spindle-shaped red cells. These are smooth muscle cells. Do these cells produce slow waves? No, they shoot out or they trigger action potentials. The smooth muscle cells are connected to each other by gap junctions, and the smooth muscle cells are also connected to the Cajal cells by gap junctions. So everything is connected by gap junctions. Okay. Now the Cajal cells produce these depolarizing waves or slow waves. If the wave is strong enough, as you can see by the black arrow, a strong slow wave triggers opening up of voltage-gated calcium channels on the muscle cell. As these channels open up, calcium enters the muscle cell, causing it to depolarize, and when it's depolarized enough, the muscle cell shoots out an action potential and ultimately leading to contraction, which is very much needed for segmentation to take place. Now, I want my students to understand that these contractions or these stimulations, they travel short distances. Therefore, Cajal cells need to initiate the same process for a nearby muscle contraction to take place. So let's say the Cajal cells are causing the muscle cells to depolarize in this area. In a neighboring area, the same process will be repeated to produce similar muscle contraction. And when we put all these together, that produces multiple contractions, which is very much required for segmentation to take place. If this is not clear from my lecture, please do shoot me an email with specific question so I can get back to you and explain you the process one more time. Do not email me saying, can you explain how the Cajal cells work? No, you need to email me with specific question which will show that you have actually studied the video and you are having some genuine issues. All right, moving on to the large intestine. Okay, so this is the picture of the large intestine. You have looked at it during your anatomy class, but my lecture warrants a quick review of the anatomy of the large intestine. So the distal end of the small intestine, which is called ileum, is connected to the large intestine via a valve called ileocecal valve, which is labeled right here. Now this pouch-like structure here is called cecum, which is the first part of the large intestine that leads to the ascending colon, which moves superiorly. Then the ascending colon makes a 90-degree turn and continues as the transverse colon. The transverse colon then makes another 90-degree turn and moves inferiorly as the descending colon. The descending colon then forms a S-shaped sigmoid colon that leads to the rectum, and the rectum ultimately terminates into the anal canal. in short, these are the different areas of the large intestine. Okay, now the question is, what is happening in the large intestine? I want my students to know and remember this for testing purpose. Okay, so most of the digestion of food take place in the small intestine, and the small intestine is also the major site for absorption of nutrients. So majority of digestion and absorption take place in the small intestine, not in the large intestine. So Rupa, what is the large intestine doing then? Well, large intestine is a site for water reabsorption and electrolyte reabsorption. So let's move on. So functions of the large intestine, it's mainly responsible for water reabsorption and electrolyte reabsorption, and the undigested food material is compacted in the large intestine to form fecal matter. The large intestine also holds a fecal matter for a considerable amount of time until we get rid of the fecal matter from the body by the process of defecation. So to review, remember that large intestine is responsible for absorption of water and electrolytes, whereas small intestine is the main site for chemical digestion and absorption of nutrients. Clear? Okay. Now we will talk about some clinical abnormalities associated with the large intestine. The first one is appendicitis. So appendicitis is inflammation of the appendix. I want you to know that appendix is a vestigial organ and it has no role in digestion. However, food and other fecal matter can enter the appendix, causing it to inflammate, and that leads to appendicitis. So what is there in the appendix? The appendix contains lymphoid nodules and a population of commensal bacteria that help to replenish a normal intestinal microbiota. However, if you have a patient with appendicitis and if that is left untreated, the appendix can burst and all the fecal matter and other things that are in the inflamed appendix will just spread into the peritoneum, leading to infection, which can ultimately cause death of the patient. All right. Another clinical problem associated with large intestine is diarrhea. And the most common cause of diarrhea is stomach flu, which causes inflammation of the large intestine, and we excrete excessive volume of fluid through our fecal matter. Again, if left untreated, this can lead to severe dehydration and even death. So to review, we talked about the two main types of movements in the small intestine. Yes. And those two types of movements are peristalsis and segmentation. Peristalsis is prominent in the esophagus and stomach, but it's weak in the small intestine. The dominant contractile force in the small intestine is segmentation. We did see how the interstitial cells of Cajal produce slow waves that causes the smooth muscle cells to depolarize, shoot out an action potential, leading to segmentation. We then talked about the anatomy of the large intestine super briefly, and then we talked about the function of the large intestine. We also talked about appendicitis and diarrhea associated with problems of the large intestine. All right, so I'll stop here, and we will talk about the accessory digestive organs in my next video. Thanks.